Good to be with you guys. You can certainly find these interviews, Jay Fuller interviews, on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Certainly subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's easy to do so. There's a little greater than icon at the bottom of the screen. We certainly encourage you to do that so you don't miss any interviews. You can go back and watch those that we've previously had as well. Joining me now, this is Jason Romano from Sports Spectrum. Jason, good to see you.
Good to see you, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Well, let me first bring up your website, jasonromano.com. You were an executive with, well, can we even say the 4 letters? When I put this up, it looks like I'm swearing, but you were a producer with them. Can you just share that experience, how that opportunity came to you?
Yeah. So it's funny you say executive. I don't think I made the executive ranks at ESPN, to be quite honest with you, but I was a producer, a senior manager, and kind of one of those middle management guys, as I would like to say. Worked there 17 years and had a great experience working there. I tell people it was a dream job, but growing up, I didn't dream big enough. Like I grew up in a very small town outside of Albany, New York, in the capital region, northeast of in New York State. And my dream was to really just be on the local TV station in Albany someday and maybe do sports. I didn't dream big enough to work at a place like ESPN. But it happened, and it came about in a bunch of different unique ways that allowed me to kind of experience some of the amazing things that a place like ESPN can offer. And certainly, the first is just being at a place that everybody watches if you're a sports fan. And you realize that the work you're doing is listened to and heard and watched by so many people, which is a pretty neat thing. But then you get to meet some of your heroes and your stars, the stars in the sports world that you watched and dreamed about someday meeting maybe as a kid. And then as I got older and had experiences at ESPN to be able to meet those people, those dreams sort of came true as well. So had an opportunity to work there, loved it. It was, like I said, after you start settling in and kind of get over the mystique initially when you first start working there, you realize it is an amazing place to work. And I tell people it was like we got to play in the toy department every single day. That's what it was, because I love sports, and you obviously have to be really good at what you do to work there. But we were doing sports. There was nothing really too serious that we had to deal with, when it came down to just a simple game or, a stat or an athlete or something like that. So it was a lot of fun.
So let's back up for a second. You said you grew up outside of Albany, New York. I'm about 30 minutes from Burlington, Vermont. So which town did you grow up?
It's very small. It's called Ravenna. So if you've heard of it, I'd be shocked. But it's got a couple thousand people. It's about 20 miles or 20 minutes south of Albany. I do have family. My wife's family is up there in Burlington, Vermont. So I've been up in those areas a couple times visiting. So yeah, grew up in that Albany area, the capital region. And again, if you've heard of Ravenna, we need to get to know each other a little bit, because I'll be shocked unless you're from that area.
There's probably a Wesleyan church there. I'm a Wesleyan pastor, and we planted churches in the middle of nowhere. So if that's where you grew up, we probably have a church there. But Jason, talk to me about growing up. Did you play sports? What was your first love? Was it just to be a fan and just be around it, or were you an athlete and you really enjoyed getting involved that way?
Well, I'm very careful to use the word athlete, but I did play, and I was okay. I played Little League, was probably the first sport I ever played, Little League baseball. And, it was pretty good, made the all-star teams there, and then got into basketball when I got to middle school. And I loved football from a very young age, but I never played. And I don't know if it was fear of getting hurt or going through the workouts that you had to go through to play. But I loved football, loved to watch it. In fact, my first love from a sports fan perspective is football. Being 6 or 7 years old, I grew up a Dallas Cowboys fan. And so watching the Cowboys at 6, 7, 8 years old is I don't know if they're great memories, but it's very vivid watching those, as a kid. But playing baseball, playing basketball was really the sport that I gravitated toward most in terms of playing, and played all throughout high school. Even played a little bit of college in a community college that I went to, played some college basketball there. And so it was okay. I'm careful when I say athlete, because, I was not gifted as having these athletic genes, if you will. But I will say, I wish, looking back now, that I had taken it when I was in high school more seriously,
Sure.
because I didn't work at it. I didn't spend all the off season in the summers just shooting every day 100 shots or doing these drills or trying to get better. I just kind of took whatever God gave me as a gift and just kind of did it that way. And that was fine. I had a good time, but I was never, that super, super great athlete. And that's why I realized in high school, okay, I'm not going to, probably play in college, and I'm certainly not going to go pro. So what's the next best thing? Well, you can talk about it, and you can go into broadcasting and potentially into sports broadcasting. So.
Well, congratulations. Good for you. I mean, it's quite a story and a journey. And I know for me, I actually went to a Bible college in New Brunswick, Canada, and I made the basketball team. But it's something that I don't share much because it was kind of a glorified men's league. But the Bible college changed their name. Now they have the initials KU. So I tell people, yeah, I played at KU. And then when they press a little bit further, I kind of decline. But
Kentucky, Kansas, nope, not quite.
And so I met you, learned about you, not just on your website, but certainly from Sports Spectrum. And you've authored a couple books now. We're going to talk about that shortly. But just being on Sports Spectrum, the podcast I've really enjoyed. And the latest one with Avery Johnson, the point guard for the Spurs. Then he was the Alabama college coach as well. Can you talk about when athletes like Darryl Strawberry in this picture make a profession of faith, how much pressure they have on them?
Yeah, I think, when I first got to ESPN and even probably halfway through my career, I didn't really pay attention to the faith side of so many athletes, right? Even though I had just become a man of faith, early in my tenure at ESPN. I was 27 when I gave my life to the Lord. And it was a moment where it took me 7 or 8 years to really fully comprehend and understand that decision and grow into being and living as a follower of Christ, as opposed to just a guy who goes to church on Sundays. But then I started to pay attention a little bit more to these athletes and really understand that their faith is very important to them. I remember specifically a day in 2009 when Darryl Strawberry, who was my childhood sports hero, came to ESPN, and I got to spend the day with him and kind of produce, the interviews that he was going to be doing on all the different shows that ESPN had at the time. And I'm spending the day with him. And of course, he's my childhood sports hero. So of course I want to talk about the Mets and 1986 and all of his heroics as a baseball player. But we spent pretty much the entire day talking about matters of faith, talking about addiction, talking about broken relationships, and some of the mistakes that he had made away from the field. And I realized this was bigger than just being a baseball player. Now, him being a baseball player has given him a platform to be able to be heard by a lot of people. But there is pressure, I would say. And I don't know if it's pressure as far as having to perform like an athlete would, but it's understanding that if you're a public figure and you come out as a Christian, or you publicly profess a faith in Christ, that eyeballs are on you now to see if that's real or not. And so I think there's a pressure, if you want to call it that, in living up to that faith, in being a follower of Christ, and making sure, from just in terms of the way you live, that there's an accountability there. I think a lot of guys, and listen, that's not to say that people don't make mistakes. We all do. I make mistakes every day. And I'm very aware now that, you talked about that word platform on a much, much, much smaller level, that God has given me a little platform here to be able to, influence people and write a couple books and have an audience, if you will, that might remotely care about anything I have to say. And so I want to make sure that not only am I being accountable in the world of like social media, where I'm sharing, scripture, or, how am I even responding or talking to people on social media? Like, is that a representation of this person of faith that I'm saying that I am? And then does the representation on social media, when I meet someone or when I talk to them or when I encounter someone and begin a relationship with them, am I the same person there too? And so that's where I think the pressure might lie with an athlete, because the spotlight is much brighter on those guys than it would ever be for myself. And they feel like, okay, I got to be able to represent Christ properly. 2 Corinthians 5, I think it is, says that we are ambassadors of Christ. And so to be an ambassador is to represent what you're being an ambassador for. And so I think there's a pressure on especially athletes, and I think of people like Tim Tebow and the pressure that he must face because of the platform that he carries is so large. But to be a proper ambassador, and kind of always having to be on, that can be hard sometimes because, again, we're all human. We all say things we don't mean. We all think things we don't want to think about. And we all, treat people. Hopefully we treat them well, but sometimes we don't. And so thankfully we have a God, at least in my perspective, that is a forgiving and gracious and loving God, and that mercy and grace that I need every single day is available. But that's where the pressure lies, I think, is not to sort of play a fake role in, oh my gosh, it's Darryl Strawberry, so I have to be Darryl Strawberry today. Right. But it's being a genuine, authentic person and being who you're claiming that you say you are.
Oh, for sure. We have Sports Spectrum. I just want to bring up this again because your podcast, it's so much fun. The guests that you have on, just when you talked about Darryl Strawberry, has there been a guest that you were almost starstruck that you couldn't, well, I mumble my words all the time, but where it was just kind of difficult to talk about? I know that you had, I should have written his name down. I thought I'd remember, but I think it's Todd Gongwer, a book that really stood out to you. And then Chris Singleton, who his mom was part of that group that was tragically murdered and killed in the church. When you talk to these individuals, how much are you learning about their story and about God's grace on their lives for you to apply in your own?
Oh, that's a really good question, because I think, there's a selfish nature to the podcast that I host, because if nobody else listens to it, then I get to spend 40 minutes with someone and learn about their story. And, I have notes and I have my research that I do for every single guest. Right. And so I can look at one of my notes over there and see that I have usually 9 to 10 questions that I want to kind of gather together and potentially ask the guest. But my hope is I don't ask any of them, that it's just a good free flowing conversation. But I would say the majority of guests that I have, I usually have the prep done. But then below that paper with the prep is my notes that I'm taking as I'm interviewing these people, because they're giving me and their answers and questions to what I'm asking them. They're giving me wisdom, right? And hopefully everybody else listening can gather and receive that in the same way that I do. But I learn all the time when I interview a lot of people. Sometimes I'm just learning somebody's story, but there's times when, you mentioned Todd Gongwer, his book that I read 5, maybe even 10 years ago now, Lead for God's Sake, profoundly impacted me. And it really got my attention and kind of piqued my interest in the idea of servant leadership, which is what my new book's on. So Todd had a big influence even on the fact that I would ever write a book on leadership, just because I read his book, but I had never interviewed him. And so having him on, and when we did the interview a month or so ago, I could have gone 2 hours with him, just asking him questions of things that I was interested in. So I learned from every guest I think that I've interviewed on the podcast, and we've done now over 500 interviews. It's insane how many interviews that we've been able to put together over the past 3 years. But I learned pretty much something from everyone. There's no doubt. And some of them have amazing amounts of wisdom that I'm filling a notebook on, and others have maybe 1 or 2, quotes that will stand out. And whatever it is, I'm learning something from every person. And that's been a real blessing, because, who am I, right? Who am I to just be hosting this show and have this opportunity to do these interviews? But God has given me this platform and allowed me to do this. And so I'm just grateful. I'm grateful.
Definitely take full advantage while we can, when we can. And the first book that you wrote, Live to Forgive. And that's actually the book that Darryl Strawberry is holding in the picture behind me.
Yes.
We're going to talk about the second book. Was writing the second book easier than writing the first book, just because you had that under your belt? Or just talk about the process and Live to Forgive. I mean, I heard you talk about this book personally, but could you just share why the story of forgiveness?
Yeah. So I'll start with the book first. The story of forgiveness. Listen, honestly, I never thought I would ever write a book. I'm just being completely clear here. This was not a goal that I set when I was 21 and said, someday I'm going to write a book. And, maybe nobody will read it, but I'm going to write it. that was never my goal. My goal was to kind of end up in sports broadcasting and achieve those sort of things. And I was grateful and fortunate to be able to do that. But to write a book was not on my radar. But my relationship with my dad was certainly there for so many years. And in 2013, I was able to finally forgive him after almost 40 years of pain that he had caused myself and my brothers and my entire family over his addiction with alcohol. And so, I'm just kind of living my life right at that time. And I'm working at ESPN and still doing my thing. And I'm a husband and I'm a dad and just kind of living life. And in 2014, I decided to write a blog and start a blog. And so now I'm thinking, all right, let's start a blog because everybody's doing blogs, right? And what can I write? And so the first thing I wrote was a letter to my future son-in-law, which my daughter at the time was like 10 years old. But I just had an idea for it. So I wrote it and it kind of picked up a little traction, but what is that, right? A couple thousand people maybe read it. And I'm like, all right, the second one I'm going to write is going to be called I Forgive You, Dad. And it literally was 4 paragraphs on just me kind of explaining this story that I had gone through with my father. It's still up on the website. It's on my blog. If you search the archives, you'll find it. And it's October of 2014, I think. After people started reading that, and then in the spring of 2015, I had an opportunity to speak at my church for the first time on a Sunday morning at the pulpit. Right? Like this isn't just speaking on a Sunday morning men's group or something. No, this was church at the pulpit where the pastor normally is. And so that was a big honor for me. And my pastor said to me, hey, you can speak on whatever you want. So just pick the topic and go. And that kind of left an open door for me to kind of pick forgiveness. And I think that's because I saw the reaction from my blog and I said, well, let me see if I share this story, if there's that same reaction. And that's when I saw that people struggle with forgiveness. Yeah. Almost all of us do. And so many people came up to me after I shared the story of my dad and said, I'm living your story right now, or I have a dad who is just like yours, or my mom is your dad. And so there was a lot of relatability to what I had spoken and shared about. And a good friend, a pastor of mine from California, heard my message in my sermon. I think I might have shared it on Twitter or something. And he said, I need to talk to you. And like 3 weeks later, we get on the phone. I'm on the back lot of ESPN. Mike and Mike, I was working on that show at the time, had just finished, and I'm at my desk and he calls. And so I step outside behind the credit union. That's it. I remember this so vividly. And I'm sitting outside talking to him in June, probably of 2016 or May. And he says, hey, I heard your sermon. And I know it's the first time you ever spoke, but your story is way too powerful for that to just be the end of it. You need to write a book on this. Well, I said, what? Write a book? I'm not writing a book. I have no desire to write a book. How do you even write a book, right? And he said, no, you need to write a book. This is too powerful of a story for you not to share. And I said, well, I know you wrote a book, so how do you go about doing that? And then he just shared with me some ideas and some thoughts on how he got the book read, or published, I should say. And I remember one day going into a Panera Bread in the middle of June with my laptop, and I just wrote chapter 1. And I just started writing, and I kind of laid out some thoughts on what the chapters might look like. It was very raw. It really isn't similar to what the book came out to be. But I will say the first chapter, which ended up being me kind of taking you back to the first time I saw my dad in his drunken state and remembering it and being confused by it, which was at a Philadelphia Eagles, New York Giants game in 1984. And I was 10 years old, almost 11 years old. And that's where I started my initial writing of the book. And that's actually chapter 1 of the book now. So that's where that all came from. But, I didn't set out to write this raw, very vulnerable story. When I was kind of going through my journey here, it just kind of happened. And I realized once I talked to my dad, once I talked to my mom, my brothers, and everybody in my family and said, I'm thinking about writing this book, you're going to be a part of it, even if you don't want to, because it's all of our story and the issues. And they all signed off on it. In fact, my dad was very supportive and said, listen, make me the villain if that's what it means. But if the book can help one person on their journey of forgiveness, then you need to write it. And so that really gave me the blessing to go forth and write the book. And it took about a year or so to get it through, to find the publisher, to get the kind of book together. And the cherry on top was when I asked Daryl Strawberry, my sports hero, if he would write the foreword, and he said yes. And now suddenly I have a book, as you have in your picture right there, of me and Daryl's names on the same book.
Yeah.
Right. And that's insane to me. And so to be able to, and that picture actually is from Daryl and I both speaking at a men's conference in Wisconsin, right around when the book came out. And to be around him and to have him be so willing to lend his name to any of the work I was doing and to now call him a friend is insane as my sports hero as a kid. But it made the book, worth it. And I've heard a lot of stories from people who've read it and said it's helped them on their journey or it's helped them enter a place of forgiving. And like I said earlier, if one person could be helped by the story, that's why I wrote it. And I'm glad it is helping a lot of people. So
let's press in a little bit on that. With alcoholism, there certainly is all sorts of abuse that takes place. When did your dad break that addiction? How has your family healed after maybe even a foundation of fragility?
Yeah. So my parents divorced when I was 6. So they're obviously still divorced, but they're both a part of my life now. My dad was in and out of my life throughout my childhood, my teen years. And then as I got older and I graduated college and I eventually got married to my wife, Dawn, and then we had our daughter, Sarah, and my job at ESPN was sort of picking up steam. I had a life to live. So I was, I'm thankful to my mom that she was the sort of stable force for us to allow us to experience life and kind of sort of grow up without having to have fallen into a lot of the traps that my dad fell into. But it was 2013 and my dad was at his lowest point where he was finally able to come to a place where he was able to get sober. I'll leave the whole story out so people can go read it in the book. But let's just say that he was in a really, really dark place, a really bad place, and was able to get sober out of that, which was a complete shock to all of us, my brothers and I. Initially, when we saw him sober for 3 months, 6 months, even a year, we weren't sure if we believed it. But it was after about a year of him getting sober that we were like, well, maybe this is the real deal here, and not some couple months sober and then, moving on to, back to drinking or whatever. And we saw a change in him. It's not a spiritual change. I wish I could tell you that, he had this amazing encounter with the Lord and God healed him. And I believe God did heal him, but he was able to get sober and still not have a faith right now, a strong faith in the Lord. So, but still, it was a miracle. And if I was to tell you in all honesty that I was praying for his salvation during all these years, that would not be true. My prayer was simply for him to get sober. And I felt like if he got sober, everything else would kind of fall into place in his life, in our relationships. We'd all begin to heal a little bit. And God answered that prayer for sure. And that's what it's been really the last now 7 years that my dad was able to get sober, is that he began a process of healing within himself, healing with the relationships. And there's still some broken relationships that are very strained in his life that he's never been able to heal. And, that's unfortunate. But for my brothers and I, even for my mom, a lot of our family has been able to forgive him. He's been able to forgive himself. And honestly, I've been able to forgive myself because I didn't treat him very well for many years either. But we've all been through this process, which is what I tell people. Forgiveness is a process. It's not microwavable. It's not instantaneous. It's a process that really continues for the rest of your life. But in that process is where the healing takes place. And it's been nice to see that, because I know a lot of people who haven't been able to heal and whose relationships are not repairable or are able to reconcile with someone who hurt them. But for us, we were able to do that.
And definitely forgiveness is for you. It's not necessarily for the other person. And that old saying that's true. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. That's unforgiveness.
Yep.
But Jason Romano, thank you so much just for sharing. And I do encourage those that listen or watch, just pick up Live to Forgive and go through that. But talk to me about this new book, The Uniform of Leadership. I really enjoyed how you talked about servant leadership. I think there is only one type of leadership, which is servant leadership. All good leaders know how to serve and connect with their people that way. What led you to write this book?
Yeah. So if you were ever to ask me 5, 6, 7 years ago to, if I was to say, hey, Jason, you're going to write a book someday, what do you think you would write it on? It would have been this. Now, I don't necessarily know if it would have been on leadership, but it definitely would have been on the idea of my time working at ESPN and the stories that I was able to experience working there, because it was 17 years. It's easily the most consistent question that I get from people when I meet them is, what was it like to work at ESPN? Who were some of the people that you got to meet at ESPN? What were some of the lessons that you learned working at ESPN? And so that's where this book comes from. It's leadership lessons. As I started to put it together and kind of share the stories with my collaborator, Stephen Copeland, my co-author, him and I were putting together ideas for the book, the second book. I said, well, I have all these stories. I want to tell these stories, but I don't just want it to be story time with Jason, because I think there has to be some application here.
Sure.
And it's nice to read stories, but they're not that interesting where you just want to read those stories. I think there has to be some kind of application with it. And like I said, leadership has been something that has really been on my heart now for the last 5, 6 years. I've been devouring leadership books from guys like John Gordon and John Maxwell, and even you mentioned Todd Gongwar and Simon Sinek. I mean, guys that I'm really interested in, people that I've gotten to meet and talk to, and just loving the idea of the consistency of all their messages, which is servant leadership. In fact, like you said, you don't even have to use the word servant in there. If you want to know what is a successful leader, what is the proper way to lead, it's to be a servant. And, then I go to the Gospels and I look at Jesus and his life, and I see a guy who says in Matthew 28, he says, listen, the Son of Man, Matthew 20, I'm sorry, verse 28, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And I'm thinking, okay, if Jesus is saying that he came to this earth to serve others when he is claiming to be the Son of God and the Savior of the world, then maybe that's how we should all be thinking about leading. And I look at Jesus's life and see a guy who was probably the greatest leader. I'm not going to say probably, he is the greatest leader that I've ever seen on this earth. And so I modeled the principles and lessons that I knew about Jesus, took the stories that I had from ESPN and put them together to create this leadership book. The Uniform of Leadership certainly has a sports, metaphor, if you will, with the idea of putting on a uniform every day. And that's where the book came from. And I'm really proud of it, because it's not what it was initially. It's very similar to Live to Forgive in the sense that we knew the basic idea and premise of the book. But even the first manuscript that we sent in, it was not the title of the Uniform of Leadership. It was, I think, Bloom Where You're Planted was the idea that I had for the title, which is actually the title for the second chapter now, which is good. So we kept Bloom in there somewhere. But the publishers, Kriegel, came up with the idea for the Uniform of Leadership. So all credit goes to them. And then we crafted this book around that title. And I think it's really good now. It's come out in a unique way that can help people thinking, whether they're in the sports space as coaches, as athletes, as directors, but also anybody in the business world, certainly the faith world, can read this book and kind of instill some of the principles, I think, that come from being a leader. And you know what? You don't have to be the vice president or the senior manager like I was at ESPN or the anything title-wise to be a great leader. One of the chapters in my new book is called Lead Like Tammy. Tammy was the cashier person running the register at the cafeteria at ESPN for all the years I was there. So title-wise, she's not like running ESPN, but guess what? She may have been the best, if not one of the 2 or 3 best leaders that I ever saw in 17 years at ESPN. Why? Because she was all about serving others, and she made people feel special and awesome right in those 35 to 40 second time frames of when people would interact with her every day at the cafeteria. Tammy was an amazing leader. And so I wanted people to read this and say, okay, maybe I'm not in the position to be a vice president and to be a boss. Well, there's a big difference between being a boss and being a leader. And you can be a leader right where you're at, wherever you're at, and lead like God, lead like Jesus.
No doubt. And I think the scripture says that if you're faithful in a little, then he can trust you with more. I'm just looking right here on the website where it talks about stories from Tony Dungy, Daryl Strawberry, Will Ferrell, and Dwayne The Rock Johnson. I need to get non serious for a moment. The
Yeah,
Rock. I like The Rock.
me
So can
too.
you just give a snippet of that story without giving it all away, where people will still go out and purchase the uniform of leadership? What is it about The Rock that makes this book that's so memorable for you?
Well, I'll say The Rock, the part that's in the book, I won't give away, but let's just say The Rock recognized people in the moment and the platform that he had to influence others, even at a place like ESPN. So, backstory, he had a new movie coming out, and I think it was called Journey to the Mysterious Island.
Okay.
And it was a Disney movie. And so The Rock was being made available to come to Bristol, Connecticut at ESPN and do a bunch of interviews to promote the movie. I was the person assigned to spend the day with The Rock and make sure that he was taken care of, to take him from show to show, and to, in essence, talent produce his day at ESPN. By the way, a day at ESPN, we called it the car wash. So when you read the book, you'll read about the ESPN car wash. And The Rock was there that day. And first of all, I didn't know what to call him. Do I call him Dwayne? Do I call him The Rock? And he's like, call me whatever you want. I was like, okay, well, it's probably going to be Dwayne. Just because I didn't want to get beat up, right? But he's been called The Rock for years, so it wasn't a big deal. But the idea around spending the day with The Rock was pretty awesome, because he was just becoming at that point the big movie star that he is now, right? I love The Rock in 1999 when he was with the WWF or WWE.
You smell what The Rock is cooking.
So he was very, very influential on my life as a 25-year-old, kind of coming back to wrestling. And so I remember that Rock, and just the idea of spending the day with him was a really exciting one for me. He kept it interesting. Let's say it that way. He was joking consistently. Sometimes I had to reel him in a little bit. I'll just say that. But he also recognized because remember, ESPN has a bunch of employees there, but we're also all fans. And so when a fan would come up and shake his hand, or maybe even try to take a quick picture, which we weren't really supposed to do, but people did it, he recognized that and would say, let's just do this real quick. And he would make that moment. He would make that memory. And that's where the story in the book is about a specific moment where he made a memory for my mentor, one of my mentors who I worked with at ESPN. He made a memory for his son that I just was so profound for me to watch how he treated that kid at a place like ESPN, where he was just there to do business, to promote his movie. And I'm like, this is the real deal here. This is a guy who is recognizing the platform that he's on. He recognizes how big and how people look at him. And he doesn't have to be a jerk about it. He could have, because he was a big movie star, and he could have just been like, nah, I'm good. But he didn't. He recognized the moment and he made a memory. And great leaders do that, right? They recognize the moment to make someone else feel like they're the most important person at that time. And that's what I experienced when I was with The Rock that day. So it was good.
Well, I think that we can all learn something about how Jesus lived. He walked slowly through the crowd, and sometimes we have something so important, pressing, we think that needs to get done, that we miss special moments.
Yes.
Without using names, I think any industry, but whether it's ESPN, you'd sometimes wonder about if people have read their own scouting report, and what is it about just that authenticity of knowing there is a job to do and to do well, but you still can pause just to, it sounds terrible, but make time for the quote little people and not just be so motivated with your own passion or job description.
Well, I think we're all wired to be selfish, unfortunately. And, that's part of the sin nature that we're all born with and that we all kind of have to work through. The very first person that most of us think about, unfortunately, is ourselves. And that's actually the metaphor of the idea of the uniform of leadership. Is wearing the uniform backwards is when we're thinking of ourselves first and not others. Wearing the uniform properly is when others are being thought of first, God, others, and then ourselves. We're third in that sort of frame of words. And I think when I think about athletes or entertainers or any kind of famous person, a lot of them wear their uniform on backwards, and nobody gets mad at them or could blame them, because they've achieved what they've achieved. And so they they feel a sense of entitlement or a sense of what's the benefit for me on this. A lot of them are doing this out of obligation, although it was good to have the people who came to ESPN, especially the athletes, but there was an excitement about that, especially I would say also movie stars and musicians, because they're all sports fans. So to come to ESPN was different than just going through, the Today Show or Good Morning America or any of the morning shows where they've done a million times. They got to come and talk about sports. But there were some, and I'm not going to name names, of course, who were all about wearing the uniform of leadership backwards, and it was all about them and what's in it for me, and are you going to take care of me and make sure that my day, and if I don't like this, I'm going to tell you that I don't like this, and I'm going to be a jerk about it. Unfortunately, there were some of those days too, but the great leaders and the ones that stick out to me and the ones that are featured in this book are people who said, okay, I know that I hate to say this, but I know that I'm a big deal. Yeah. But I'm not going to act like a big deal here. I'm going to make sure that I look at people and treat them the same way I would want to be treated, right? To pause. Like you said, I love the idea of Jesus walking slowly through the crowds and recognizing the moments that could happen by doing that. Not everybody is good at that, including myself, but these athletes and these entertainers and the people who came through ESPN, they knew that they were there for a certain amount of time. So they weren't in a rush in that 3-4 hour time frame, unless I made them be in a rush. That was part of my job, was to take them from show to show. So if The Rock is going to stop and talk to someone, I know that they got 2 minutes, and then I gotta whisk him away because we got to get to the next show. Sure. So I'm the one that can be the bad guy, not him. But at the same token, he was really, and others were really all about making that moment special for others. And, that's what I always say, that's what people will remember. Darryl Strawberry actually told me this one time. He said, because when Darryl came to ESPN, it was just me and him. It was 11 years ago. He didn't have an entourage or anybody with him. And it probably was 15 or 20 people that came up and asked him for autographs and asked him for pictures. And initially I was kind of taken back by it. And he's like, no, don't worry about it, Jason. If you have the time, I have the time. And I said, okay. And Darryl, did a bunch of, autographs, just walking to show or took him pictures. And then we were having lunch in the cafeteria in the middle of our day. And I said to him, don't you get tired of people recognizing you or coming up to you and wanting you to sign things or take pictures? And he said, Jason, I could get tired, but I want the people who meet me, like the people today, like you, if we never see each other ever again or have another conversation, I want that person to walk away and say, okay, I like this guy. Yeah. He treated me right. He was kind. He was compassionate. I want them to have a great memory of me and not a bad memory. And so I always try to be kind, considerate, and respond as best I can when people want to have that memory for me. And I was like, wow, that makes complete sense. Because you and I, we could do this interview, Jeff, and I could be a complete jerk to you, and we might never talk to each other again. And I just kind of walk away and go about the rest of my life. But you will have this memory of me forever. And it could be the same way with you. I could have this memory of you forever and be like, well, that's probably not, even if Jeff isn't really that way all the time, he was really bad that day. And so I have that memory of him. And Darryl recognized and said, listen, even if I never speak to any of these people ever again, I want to make sure that they walk away and say, thank you. You helped me make a memory that was a positive one. And I remembered that for the rest of my life. I still am like that today.
And what a lesson that can be. I have a serious question, then a couple quick hitters, and we'll get you
sure.
out.
Whatever you got.
I just listened to the podcast with Kyle Korver. He's a white basketball player in the NBA, talking about the social injustice that he sees, the white privilege that he's had, and engaging in the conversation. Our society certainly is a mess right now. I do believe there's a hope being a Christian and having a faith in Jesus. But how important do you think it is that Christians listen and allow for the uncomfortable conversations to take place regarding race?
It's so important, in my opinion. We're to mourn with those who mourn and weep with those who weep. And initially, I wasn't sure, what my responsibility was as a white dude who's in my middle 40s, who grew up in a very small, middle class, I guess is the best way, lower to middle class household, broken household, but a very white neighborhood. And, now thankfully with my job and having worked at ESPN, I have many friends who are of color. I have my Black brothers and sisters, people I worked with who are friends for life. Many of them who are Christian too, which is nice. And I didn't understand because I'm white. I don't understand, a lot of this. I can lament and I can listen and try to be as educated as possible. But can I fully ever understand? I don't think so. I can't understand what it's like to be Black. Right. So for me, it's been vital to listen. And you mentioned the Kyle Korver interview. When we took that interview and I had that opportunity with me and Kyle to do an interview, I needed to bring another voice in because it was two white guys talking about race. And not only are the optics not good in that, but Kyle is the same way. Like, we're just two white guys. We can't really understand here. So I brought in my friend Wesley Woodyard, who plays with the Titans as a linebacker in the last few years. And he's a Black man. And I said, Wes, could you come in and kind of help me co-host this thing and ask the questions and even respond to some of the things that, have been going on? And he said, yes, thankfully. And that helped kind of diversify the conversation in a way that I thought was much better. But for me, it's been about listening. That interview was about me listening and learning from a guy like Kyle, who's in a very dominated Black league, as is the NBA. Right. It was important for me to listen to Wesley Woodyard. It was important for me to listen to Brian Laritz, who's a pastor that I had on the show a couple days earlier, who's a Black pastor, but loves Jesus and teaches about Christ, and hear it from those guys and just learn and listen. I am on social media a lot and I hear and see people there too, but I'm not going to just gather up all my information from Twitter or Facebook and say I have it all figured out. So I've had to have conversations both on the podcast, but even away, and just texting or calling my Black friends who are followers. The people who I want to talk to are the ones who are followers of Christ, because that's where I'm aligning my faith with. And I'm not against hearing anybody's thoughts on this, but I really want to talk to my Black brothers and sisters in the Lord and hear where they're coming from. And, even talking to my white friends too, and kind of understanding where they're coming from and in hearing things that aren't aligning with all of this. Right. Yeah. And I'm like, all right, man, where's my thoughts coming from here? Where's what kind of decisions or processes am I going to make in my life based upon the things that I'm hearing from different people? And I've really made a point now to just show empathy. And I wish that's a word that I talk about in both books, Live to Forgive and The Uniform of Leadership. One of the chapters in The Uniform of Leadership is simply called Big Time Empathy. And I wrote that way before George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or any of these unfortunate situations took place. But I was rereading it just a couple of days ago, and I thought, man, if we can have our takes, our opinions, our thoughts on things, but if we just all had empathy, that it's okay to disagree, whatever that might be that you disagree with. And it's also okay to agree, but empathy allows you to see it from another person's point of view and feel with them and lament with that person. And really, that's where my heart's been in the past, say, month, since Memorial Day, I think was when George Floyd was murdered, and everything kind of blew up after that. So it's been about a month. And from that moment on, that's really my thing is, okay, remember, have empathy. Even if you're not agreeing with a take from a leader of our country or somebody else, or if you're not agreeing with a friend of yours who you worked with for so many years, who's posting something, or if you are agreeing with someone who's not been through something and has a different opinion on it, remember to show empathy wherever you're going to go with this. And I've been very careful not to post a lot on social other than just letting people know, especially my Black brothers and sisters, I'm with you. Your lives absolutely matter. Yeah. And just learning from that and not just being judgmental or having this spirit of a disagreement, which unfortunately many people have.
Yeah, which is truly unfortunate. If we just did what Jesus did, he loved people and spent time with people. If we did that more, it would definitely be better. Jason, couple quick hitters. So church has gone online. You being a producer, how can we as pastors do a better job with the online experience? I see some pastors, the camera is like 200 yards away. I see some people where the transitions are terrible, or you have 10 minutes and announcements. From the producer side, how can churches make this online church thing a little bit more feasible or presentable or, consumable?
It's a good question. I'm an elder at my church, and so we've been walking through this since March ourselves. Thankfully, we have been online already, and so it was really just a matter of pivoting to that only for so many weeks. I know that there was a lot of online um, weariness, we'll say. People were getting tired of watching church online. I know a lot of people are itching to go back, and we've started to open up our doors on a smaller level and having church again. But as a producer, if I'm putting on my producer hat, the one thing I've learned from even just our production, but others that I've watched, is people are trying to replicate the Sunday morning experience online, and it's very hard to do that. Most people, this is my experience too. Most people, when we just did church the way we did it before, 4 worship songs, announcements in the middle, and then the pastor coming and giving his message. It's hard to sit through all of that and continue to get people engaged online. So my experience tells me that 1, maybe 2 songs of worship and then go right to the sermon is the best way to do it, with a welcome in the middle or in the beginning. And certainly, interacting online is big. So I'm thinking about Facebook and YouTube. When you go live, you can actually have a chat session running at that same time. And I would invest in at least one person to be able to, sort of moderate that chat, moderate what's going on, and talk to people online, offer up ideas, offer up prayers if they need them, but really catering it to the online community. Church looks different online than it does when you go into a building. And unfortunately, too many people were trying to take what you would do when you walk into the building and trying to bring it online. I don't think that that's really feasible. There are things that you do in the building that you can bring to an online, but I think it's got to be more of a condensed, I don't like to use the word well-produced, but that's what it is. If you're going to do it online, 1 to 2 songs was what I noticed, as I mentioned, for worship, that is probably going to keep your attention. Maybe even just 1, just to kind of get yourself in the mode of worship. I don't think people are watching church online, Jeff. Maybe I'm wrong. And standing up and worshiping when it's time to stand up and worship when they're watching it online. I just don't see that. And so maybe 1 song and then engage them really during the sermon. That's where you want people to kind of feel like they're connecting, they're listening, and then produce it properly. Get a couple cameras in the right spot. Spend a little money. It doesn't have to be a ton. If you have an iPhone, a tripod, and a wireless mic, you can probably get that for under $100.
Yeah.
You can put on a decent online representation of a message from a pastor and make it sound and look pretty good. And so invest in that a little bit. And, I think unfortunately, online church before March 10th was looked at as kind of like maybe a nice second option, but a lot of people weren't taking it seriously. And suddenly, even my brother's church had to do this. Many churches were never online, and suddenly they had to figure it out how to do it. And when you're figuring out how to do something that you've never done before, it's probably not going to be the best presentation, unfortunately. So spend some time, take it seriously. You can reach a lot of people. We were reaching thousands of people every week with views on our social media posts for our church online. And our church holds about 300 people every week. So the mass reach that you're going through here, it can be really effective, and take that seriously. You don't want to replace church on a Sunday morning when you're gathering the people together. I don't think that you want to replace that, because I still think there's a very important aspect of the communities coming together in person to corporately worship together. But having this option can really help a lot of people and reach a lot of people. And it's also one more thing, Jeff, to keep it consistent throughout the week, not just on Sunday mornings. You don't have to be online every day for an hour,
right?
But just checking in, offering up prayers, devotionals, other kinds of content that you can share throughout the week really helps create a place digitally where your parishioners are comfortable am willing to then engage. And then hopefully that might even draw them to come to the church on a Sunday morning or a Saturday night and actually engage in person.
Well, for sure. I think great advice. Thanks so much for making the time and sharing. The final question is simply this. As I found out, you have a doppelganger, or at least I thought he looked like you, a Major League Baseball player with the
Yes.
same name as you.
Yes.
How often do you use his identity to get into things or to book interviews with Sports Spectrum? Or what's it like to be confused with somebody with your same name?
So I've never used the idea that I'm the sports guy Jason Romano and I'm actually the other guy. So I've never taken advantage of that, and I would never would. But there is another person with the exact same name as myself, spelling wise, who played Major League Baseball, and he came through the minor league system in early 2000s, like 2002, 2003. I think he was with the Dodgers and the Rangers, and believe me, there was a connection right away when I was working at ESPN at the time when I saw that there was a guy in the major leagues with the same name as me. And that was pretty cool. I even got his jersey when he was playing with the Rangers because I was so excited to see somebody with the Romano name on the back of a Major League Baseball jersey. But I've never taken advantage of it ever. And I'm not sure that anybody would, like if I said that and played in the majors, if that's going to get me any better of an interview than maybe I could get otherwise. But I will say it's been pretty cool. I've been mistaken a couple times, but not often. I think if you Google my name in ESPN, I will show up. If you Google my name in like Major League Baseball, his name will show up. Hopefully, it doesn't get too confusing with this book out too, and people think that a Major League Baseball player wrote this new book, because that's not the case. But I am honored that there's somebody that played Major League Baseball that has the same name as me. I wish it was me, but unfortunately it's not.
I think God's using you just where you are. So,
That's right.
Jason, thank you so much. The Uniform of Leadership, it comes out later in July. We just thank you for making time to share some of your story. And when the book comes out, I'll definitely read it. We'll get you back on and talk about some of these stories with The Rock, Will Ferrell, and some of the others. But Jason, thank you for making the time today.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thanks for having me. And this has been awesome. Thank you for inviting me, and all the best to you.
Thank you. And again, Jason Romano, jasonromano.com. I encourage you to check out the podcast at sportsspectrum.com as well. Jay Fuller Interviews is where you can find all of these interviews and more. There's a little greater than icon at the bottom of the screen to subscribe so you don't miss any of these interviews, and you can go back and listen or watch to the others. We'll talk to you again soon. Enjoy this heat wave and enjoy the crowd as you walk slowly through it.